In the gamble of marriage, staying together till old age can be either a blessing or a curse. Your daily duties will involve cooking and taking care of my wife. Do you have any objections? The silver-haired man, his hair meticulously combed, wore an open sea blue shirt complemented by a silk scarf. His white trousers and matching leather shoes made him look sharp and clean. Standing before him, I felt like a stray dog. No objections, I stammered nervously. This was my first job after graduation, unexpected, but better than begging my parents for money. I'm very busy and seldom home, so I'll be entrusting my wife to your care, he continued. Uncle Lee, you can count on me. Don't call me Uncle Lee. Just call me Mr. Lee from now on, he interrupted, a slight displeasure flickering across his face. Clearly, he didn't appreciate being addressed in an age-revealing manner. I quickly nodded and corrected myself. Mr. Lee, I'll remember that. Adjusting his gold-rimmed glasses, he scrutinized me once more before saying, Follow me. I'll take you to meet my wife now. Walking behind Mr. Lee, I seized the chance to sneak a look around the house. This grand, old-style villa was something I'd only seen on TV. Had it not been for this housekeeping job, I'd never have had the chance to step into such an impressive place. The furniture, bearing the marks of time, was clearly valuable. I treaded carefully across the wooden floor, even feeling its polished texture through my shoes. The house's intricate decor and antique furnishings exuded a sense of understated luxury. We reached a room on the second floor, and as Mr. Lee opened the door, a strange, overwhelming odor hit me. The smell starkly contrasted with the house's elegance, catching me completely off guard and making me gag audibly. Mr. Lee, however, remained unperturbed. Standing at the doorway, he pointed towards the bed. Following his gesture, I saw a frail, emaciated woman lying there. This is Palon. I've hired a new caregiver for you, someone to take care of you from now on, Mr. Lee said. Judging by his tone, I assumed this was his wife. The woman half reclined against a pillow, her eyes shut and face expressionless. Her pale complexion was devoid of any vitality. She was so thin that her cheekbones were unnervingly prominent. Her disheveled white hair framed her face in a way that felt eerie.
Palon.
Mr. Lee called out twice more, but she remained motionless, almost as if lifeless. I grew uneasy, fearing that I might lose this job before it even began. She's always like this, drowsy and unresponsive. Why don't you tidy up the room first? When she wakes up, you can introduce yourself, Mr. Lee suggested, evidently in a rush to leave. I nodded, resolving first to open the window and air out the room. I'm heading out now. I won't be back for lunch. If anything happens, just give me a call, he said, glancing at his watch before quickly exiting the room. Once he was downstairs, I hurried over to the window, ready to push it open. But a frail voice from behind stopped me. Don't open it. I'm cold. As I lifted the blanket covering the lady, I couldn't help but gag again, leaning over the bed in discomfort. The incontinence pad underneath her was thoroughly soaked in brownish liquid. Her bare lower body was submerged in it, leaving only her two shriveled legs, thin like bamboo sticks, floating limply on the pad. I finally understood the source of the stench that was so overwhelming. I'm so sorry, child, she said softly. Barely able to stop gagging, I stammered apologetically. Madam, I'm sorry, Despite mentally preparing for this job beforehand, I was utterly shocked by the reality. It's all right. I look such a mess, no one can stand it. If the smell is too much, feel free to wear a mask, she said gently, her deeply sunken eyes revealing helplessness. Her vulnerability filled me with guilt, and I quickly started changing her incontinence pad. When I turned her over, I noticed her back was covered in bed sores, many of which were oozing pus, a sight almost too painful to bear. Does it hurt? I asked. I'm used to it, she replied. I immediately looked up care instructions for bed sores online and began cleaning her wounds. By the time I was done, bloody cotton swabs were strewn all over the place. I could feel how much pain she must have endured. Yet she stayed silent throughout, as obedient as a child. After finishing, I was drenched in sweat. Once I tucked her in, I prepared to take out the trash, but she suddenly asked me, "Child, will you stay?" I will. I answered almost instinctively. Perhaps it was the decent pay, or maybe it was the yearning I saw in her eyes. Thus began my life as her caregiver. I never imagined my cooking skills would be so appreciated by someone. Watching her devour her food eagerly, I almost doubted that I had cooked it myself. "Madam, please slow down, don't choke," I said cautiously, holding a glass of water nearby and genuinely worried about her pace. "It's delicious. Then what did you eat before?" I couldn't resist asking. "We used to have a housekeeper cook for me. Later, when she quit, Old Lee would eat outside and bring back leftovers for me," she said. "Mr. Lee seems quite busy." "He is quite busy." She didn't seem keen on talking about Mr. Lee, and I didn't press further. Apart from topics related to Mr. Lee, she loved to chat, and we got along well as the days passed. That night, as I was about to close the curtains for her to sleep, she suddenly said urgently, "Please, don't close the curtains, okay?" I was puzzled. "Madam, leaving the curtains open might disturb your rest." "It won't. With the curtains open, I can distinguish between day and night. Time feels less unbearable that way." Looking at the pleading in her eyes, I let go of the curtains I had been holding. When Mr. Lee returned late that night, he seemed in high spirits, humming a tune. As I walked over to greet him, he was startled. "Oh, you little girl. Why do you walk so quietly? Announce yourself before approaching next time." I nodded, taking his coat. He glanced towards the second floor before asking quietly, "The madam, is she asleep?" I nodded again. "How is she today? Her appetite?" "She was fine. Her appetite was good," I replied truthfully. That's good. With that, he went straight into his room. This elderly couple's relationship struck me as odd. There was something strange about it, though I couldn't quite pinpoint what. After a month, I had gradually adapted to the household and developed a close bond with the lady. "Xiao Xia, stop calling me madam. It feels odd. If you don't mind, just call me Aunt Xiao from now on," she said one day. "All right," I agreed readily, feeling the new form of address added a sense of warmth between us. "How are the roses in the yard?" "I planted them 5 years ago, but haven't cared for them in 3 years." "They're doing well. They've nearly climbed up to the second floor window. Perhaps by next year, you'll be able to see them," I said. "Next year," she murmured, a touch of longing in her voice, followed by a faint smile of resignation. Sensing her thoughts, I gently held her hand and said, "Once you're feeling better, I'll take you out to the yard in a wheelchair to enjoy the sun." She looked at me in surprise for a long moment, then asked incredulously, "Really?" "Of course." She smiled, tears welling up in her eyes. Mr. Lee always dressed impeccably, living a full and seemingly vibrant life, leaving early and returning late every day. Every morning before heading out, he would stop by Aunt Xiao's door to say a quick greeting. Yet, Aunt Xiao always lay motionless with her eyes closed, as if in a deep sleep. At first, I genuinely thought she wasn't awake. But as time passed, I realized that as soon as Mr. Lee left, she would instantly brighten up, engaging with me in lively conversation. When Mr. Lee returned in the evenings, he never entered Aunt Xiao's room. Instead, he would perfunctorily ask me about her condition for the day. One time, as I was reporting her status, I carelessly referred to her as Aunt Xiao and was immediately reprimanded. "Aunt Xiao? From now on, call her madam." "Young lady, you need to understand your position here. Don't disrupt the rules of this household. If outsiders hear such a crude and improper term, we'll be ridiculed." From then on, I learned the distinction. When he was absent, she was Aunt Xiao. When he was home, she became Madam. "Aunt Xiao, why does Mr. Lee never seem to be home?" After some time, I couldn't suppress my curiosity any longer and asked, He is probably busy with his own affairs. I don't know much, she replied vaguely. For some reason, whenever the subject of Mr. Lee came up, Aunt Zhao always dismissed it lightly. In fact, ever since I started working here, I had never seen her say a word to Mr. Lee or even look at him. I guess she probably despised him, but she never expressed it openly in front of me. It was as if he were an irrelevant stranger to her. One day, Mr. Lee unexpectedly returned home at noon, but he wasn't alone. A middle-aged woman with heavy makeup accompanied him. Xiao Xia, make some coffee. As he instructed me, he eagerly took the woman's handbag and ushered her into the living room. I don't like coffee. Make me some tea instead, the woman said as she scrutinized the room. When I came back with the tea, I found Mr. Lee sitting close to her, whispering something into her ear. The woman burst into laughter, playfully raising her hand as if to swat him. Her coquettish manner seemed quite out of place for her age. Feeling awkward, I hesitated before clearing my throat to interrupt them. They toned it down slightly as I set the tea on the coffee table in front of them. There's nothing else for you to do here, Xiao Xia. Go back to your room. I'll call you if needed, Mr. Lee instructed me. I hurried to my room and closed the door. That atmosphere wasn't something I wanted to linger in. Before long, music started playing in the living room, followed by the sound of shoes tapping against the wooden floor. Curious, I cracked my door open slightly and saw Mr. Lee dancing with the woman, holding her close. Their intimacy was so blatant it made me uncomfortable. Initially, I thought the woman would leave after a while. To my surprise, 2 hours passed, and she showed no sign of leaving. But I couldn't wait any longer. I estimated that Aunt Zhao had likely woken up, and I needed to check on her. As I opened my door again to head upstairs, I noticed the living room was empty. The woman's bag was still on the sofa, which meant she hadn't left. But where were they? Suddenly, I heard laughter coming from Mr. Lee's bedroom. This was too much. Combined, their ages exceeded a century, yet here they were acting this way, with Aunt Zhao still in the house, no less. Shocked and angry on Aunt Zhao's behalf, my respect for Mr. Lee evaporated completely. Perhaps to express my dissatisfaction, or to remind them of Aunt Zhao's presence, I deliberately stomped loudly up the stairs. Opening Aunt Zhao's door, I found her lying on the bed, staring blankly at the ceiling. Aunt Zhao, you're awake? I asked gently as I approached her, inexplicably feeling guilty. Is someone visiting? I heard music downstairs, she said. Yes, Mr. Lee came home. I replied vaguely while helping her sit up. I avoided mentioning the woman altogether. Thankfully, Aunt Zhao didn't pursue the topic further, instead turning her gaze toward the sycamore tree outside the window. Xiao Xia, how quickly time passes. The leaves outside fall and regrow year after year, and I grow another year older, she murmured. Aunt Zhao, you're not old. Once you're feeling better, I'll take you to a photo studio. With modern makeup techniques, you could easily look 10 or 20 years younger. I joked, though my heart felt heavy. Hearing this, Aunt Zhao's eyes lit up with excitement. Xiao Xia, can you get my photo albums from the cabinet? I want to show you what I looked like when I was younger, she said eagerly. I fetched a stack of 10 photo albums from the cabinet, surprised there were so many. Put them here, she said, patting the space beside her. Her eyes sparkled as she looked at the albums, brimming with childlike joy. Following her instructions, I laid them out beside her. Her hand hovered over the albums before settling on the oldest one. She picked it up, smiling. This one is filled with photos from my childhood. Do you want to see? Of course, I replied enthusiastically, flipping the album open without hesitation. The black and white photos were rich in texture, revealing Aunt Zhao's life story. To my surprise, she had lived in this house since childhood. The furnishings, aside from modern appliances, remained much the same. This house used to belong to your family? I began, but stopped halfway. I had always assumed the house reflected Mr. Lee's achievements, but clearly, I had jumped to conclusions. This villa was my parents'. When they moved abroad, they left it to me. It's my way of remembering them. Aunt Zhao explained. Though her tone was calm, I could see a trace of sadness in her eyes. Why didn't you go with them? I asked. Because I got married, and he couldn't leave, so I decided to stay. Thinking of what I'd just witnessed downstairs, I felt indignant about her choice and had the urge to tell her. But I restrained myself. Acting impulsively could only hurt Aunt Zhao. I continued flipping through the album, watching her transformation from a little girl into a stunning young woman. I couldn't believe how beautiful she was in her youth. Finishing the albums, I noticed something peculiar. Most of the photos were from her childhood or before her marriage. After she got married, apart from a few wedding pictures, there were hardly any personal photos, mostly ID photos. Aunt Zhao, why didn't you take many photos after getting married? I asked curiously. My father loved photography, and he took most of these pictures. After I got married, my parents moved abroad, and no one took photos of me like that again. Her wistful tone made me realize I had asked an insensitive question. I'm sorry, Aunt Zhao, I said, embarrassed. It's all right. It's just the truth, she replied, reaching out to pat my head with a reassuring smile. Just then, the sound of high heels echoed from downstairs, followed by the woman's laughter and chatter with Mr. Li. Moments later, the front door slammed, and the house fell silent again. I was surprised that the noise from downstairs was so audible on the second floor. Did that mean Aunt Zhao heard it all as well? I glanced at her apologetically, but she seemed entirely absorbed in her photo album, as if she hadn't heard a thing. That afternoon, just as I had settled Aunt Zhao in for her nap, loud banging sounded from the front gate. In all my time here, I had never seen a visitor, and the aggressive knocks gave me an ominous feeling. Who's there? I cautiously called out through the door. I'm looking for Li Yongqiang, came a woman's voice from outside. Li Yongqiang? I guess that must be Mr. Li's full name. He's not home, I replied. The woman shouted again, her voice gruff and commanding. Then, I want to see Zhao Peilon. Now she was asking for Aunt Zhao. It was clear she knew both Mr. Li and Aunt Zhao, so she was likely an acquaintance. Yet her tone was so unpleasant that I felt reluctant to let her in. Hesitating, I heard her yell once more, Don't tell me Zhao Peilon isn't home either. I know she's always here. She seemed to be well acquainted with the household. Reluctantly, I opened the gate a crack, intending to confirm her identity before letting her in. But she shoved the gate wide open and marched straight into the house without waiting for an invitation. What are you doing? Who are you looking for? I asked, flustered, trying to stop her. The imposing woman ignored me entirely. She strode into the living room, looked around briefly, and then threw open the door to Mr. Li's bedroom. Finding it empty, she rushed upstairs and barged into Aunt Zhao's room. You're so rude. What do you think you're doing? I shouted, thoroughly enraged, as I squeezed past her to stand protectively in front of Aunt Zhao. Are you the new housekeeper? She asked, finally acknowledging my presence. Her arched eyebrows looked like two battle-ready caterpillars. What do you want with me? Came Aunt Zhao's voice from behind, evidently woken up by the commotion. Aunt Zhao, I'm so sorry. I couldn't stop her from coming in. I apologized hastily. It's all right. Go make some tea, Aunt Zhao replied, seemingly unfazed. Realizing she must be an acquaintance, I followed her instructions and went downstairs to prepare tea. When I brought the tea back upstairs, I heard the woman say to Aunt Zhao, Anyway, that's the situation. You decide what to do. Placing the tea on the table, I hesitated, unsure whether to stay or leave. Why are you still standing there? This doesn't concern you. Go on and leave, the woman snapped, trying to dismiss me. But her opinion didn't matter. I turned to Aunt Zhao, waiting for her decision. Let her stay. I've grown used to having her around, Aunt Zhao said calmly. You're not worried about her hearing this and tarnishing your dignity, the woman retorted with a sneer. You've already barged into my home to confront me. What dignity is left to protect? Coming here to lay it all out means you don't care about that either, Aunt Zhao replied coolly. She gestured for me to come closer and sit beside her on the bed. Without hesitation, I sat down, determined to support Aunt Zhao and keep her safe. This behavior seemed to provoke the woman further. She let out a cold laugh before continuing. Fine. I've already told you about my relationship with Old Li. Now give me a straight answer. Are you going to divorce him or not? I think that's a question you should be asking him, not me. Aunt Zhao replied, unruffled. I was stunned. What was going on here? Could it be that Mr. Li had another entanglement outside? At nearly 70 years old, how could he still have the energy for this? I've already asked him. He said the only reason he won't divorce you is because of your condition. He feels sorry for you, but he has no feelings for you anymore. The woman's self-assured tone made me furious. Aunt Zhao had me here. I couldn't let her be bullied like this. I jumped up, pointing at the woman, ready to confront her. But Aunt Zhao stopped me. Xiao Xia, sit down. This is not something you should get involved in. But Aunt Zhao, she's being so... Before I could finish, Aunt Zhao silenced me with a shushing gesture. Reluctantly, I sat back down, fuming. Seeing my frustration, Aunt Zhao smiled faintly. If you agree to divorce him, I promise I'll take care of you like I did before. I'll handle all your needs and won't slack off in the slightest. Or, if you have conditions, as long as the two of us can manage, we'll agree to them, the woman said, her tone softening, almost conciliatory. What was this? Like before? At this point, I was thoroughly confused. Like before? When I paid you a salary, and you fed me watery porridge every day. When you were so busy flirting with Old Li that I had to relieve myself in bed all day. If that's the kind of exchange you're offering, I'll pass. Aunt Zhao replied, her tone laced with sarcasm. The woman's thick foundation couldn't hide the flush of shame on her face. It all became clear. This woman had once worked as Aunt Zhao's housekeeper. You really shouldn't waste your time on me. If Old Li refuses to divorce me, he probably has other reasons. I suggest you focus more on him. Xiao Xia, show her out. Aunt Zhao commanded, issuing an unmistakable dismissal. As I escorted the woman out, I couldn't resist a parting shot. The other day, Mr. Li brought home a beautiful woman for a dance. Do you know her? Since you two are so close, I'm sure he's mentioned her to you, right? The woman turned to me, stunned. I didn't give her a chance to respond, slamming the gate shut behind her. What a shameless bunch. Let them all go down together. Recently, Mr. Li seemed overwhelmed, staying home for several consecutive days without stepping out. His phone rang incessantly, and he holed up in his bedroom, talking nonstop. You have to believe me, it's not like that. She's just a crazy woman. She's the one obsessing over me. I overheard him say. What could I possibly have with her? The only reason she knows so much is that she used to work as a housekeeper in my home. Think about it. How could I ever be interested in someone of her level? Trust me, aside from Zhao Peilon, who I have no choice with, you're the only one in my heart. At some point, I had become an eavesdropper, lurking outside his door to relish his moments of panic. It was immensely satisfying. Sometimes, I even wanted to run upstairs to share a few lines with Aunt Zhao, hoping to cheer her up as well. But Aunt Zhao remained inexplicably calm, so much so that I always swallowed my words. She seemed entirely unconcerned about whatever trouble Mr. Li was in. The only things that caught her attention were the trees outside the window, the photo albums in her hands, and the food I made for her. The loud banging of the gate interrupted the calm again. The sound was familiar. I suspected it was the same woman from last time. This time, I was eager to open the door promptly. After all, Mr. Li was home, and the drama could only get more entertaining. But before I could leave the living room, Mr. Li burst out of his bedroom and grabbed my arm. Xiao Xia, let me make this clear. From now on, don't open the door without my permission. Understand? His attempt at authority, mixed with a hint of panic, reminded me of a clown's oversized red nose, more laughable than intimidating. Feeling a bit disappointed, I turned back toward the kitchen to prepare something tasty for Aunt Zhao. The woman outside was relentless, hammering at the door with a determination that almost seemed admirable. For the first time, I realized how oddly delightful the sound of persistent knocking could be. I placed freshly baked pastries on a plate, humming a tune as I carried them upstairs. Sitting by Aunt Zhao's bed, I watched her savor the pastries I had made. Her face lit up with enjoyment. "Child, I absolutely love the things you make," she exclaimed, as always, showering me with praise that gave me a deep sense of accomplishment. It was thanks to Aunt Zhao's encouragement that my cooking skills had improved so rapidly. The banging at the gate continued, but neither of us acknowledged it. Ignoring it entirely might have seemed a bit rude, though. "Why aren't you opening the door?" Aunt Zhao asked casually, picking up another pastry and cleverly tossing the dilemma back to me. Mr. Li said not to. I replied honestly. "Oh. How do you get these pastries so crispy? They're absolutely delicious." Aunt Zhao deftly changed the subject, and we easily sidestepped the awkwardness of the persistent knocking. Xiao Xia, come downstairs now." Mr. Li's anxious voice called out from below. Sighing, I set down the plate and reluctantly went downstairs. "Go to the gate and tell that woman to stop knocking. If she doesn't leave, warn her that we'll call the police." Following his instructions, I sauntered over to the gate. This time, I didn't open it but spoke through the door instead. "Stop knocking. Mr. Li says if you keep at it, he'll call the police." The knocking abruptly ceased. After a moment of silence, the woman called out from the other side, "Hey, sister. I know it's you. I'm begging you. Just open the door for me, okay?" Sister? She was quite bold in trying to establish a connection. I was about to walk away when I had a second thought and returned to the door. Lowering my voice, I said, "Listen, it's not that I don't want to open the door. It's that Mr. Li forbids it. Surely you can understand my position. But this isn't a productive approach. The more you knock, the less likely you'll see him. You need a different strategy." "What do you mean by that?" she asked, clearly puzzled. "I mean, Mr. Li has to leave the house at some point. If you can't get in, you could wait for him outside. And if private discussions aren't getting through, sometimes it's better to let others weigh in. You know, public opinion can work wonders." Leaving her with that, I swiftly walked away, leaving her to figure it out on her own. A few mornings later, I returned from the market with groceries. As I approached the alley near the house, I noticed a large crowd gathered. Curiosity got the better of me, and I squeezed in to see what was happening. At the center of the commotion were two people, the persistent woman and Mr. Li, who had finally ventured out of the house after days of hiding. The woman had Mr. Li by the collar, and he looked utterly humiliated. "Everyone, listen up. This man took advantage of me and promised to marry me once his wife passed away. But now, he's off gallivanting with other women and won't even acknowledge me. Isn't he a scumbag?" she shouted. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. No one had expected such scandalous behavior from this well-dressed, seemingly refined old man. Phones came out, cameras rolling to capture the drama. Satisfied, I quietly slipped away, carrying my groceries home. It was shaping up to be another great day. After that incident, Mr. Li behaved himself for a while. But once the storm passed, he returned to his old ways, leaving early and coming home late. I felt both pity and frustration for Aunt Zhao. I couldn't understand why she wouldn't divorce him. That question, however, was soon answered, not by Aunt Zhao, but by her old friend, Aunt Xiao. I met Aunt Xiao for the first time more than 3 months after I started working here. When Aunt Zhao introduced her as a close friend, I was surprised. I had always assumed Aunt Zhao was completely alone. Aunt Zhao was visibly elated by Aunt Zhao's visit. Her spirits were high, and she looked more energetic than usual. She specifically asked me to prepare my best dishes for Aunt Xiao, eager to share something special with her friend. In front of Aunt Xiao, she even showered me with praise, leaving me both flattered and a little embarrassed. "Seeing your bedsores gone and your bedding so clean, I can tell this child takes excellent care of you. I haven't seen you smile like this in years," Aunt Xiao said as she held Aunt Zhao's hand tightly, tears glistening in her eyes. Realizing they needed some private time, I tactfully left the room. Today, I planned to wage a culinary battle in the kitchen. After all, since Aunt Xiao was Aunt Zhao's dear friend, I had to showcase my skills and prepare a proper meal. While I was busy in the kitchen, I suddenly felt someone standing behind me. Turning around abruptly, I found Aunt Xiao there. "Xiao Xia, let me help you. Let's cook together." No need, Aunt Xiao. You should go back and chat with Aunt Zhao. You two haven't seen each other in ages, I said, trying to dissuade her. Her health is fragile. I've talked with her for a bit, but she needs to rest now. Rather than sit around, I might as well lend you a hand. Before I could respond, Aunt Xiao deftly grabbed some green onions and began peeling them. Seeing this, I stopped insisting. It wasn't about avoiding work. I saw this as a golden opportunity to learn more about Aunt Zhao's past. Despite living with her for months, she rarely talked about herself, remaining a bit of a mystery to me. "Aunt Xiao, how did you meet Aunt Zhao? Were you childhood friends?" I asked, curiosity piqued. "It's a long story. I'm 5 years younger than your Aunt Zhao. I first met her in elementary school. She was in 6th grade, and I had just started 1st grade. Back then, she stood out like a crane among chickens. Everyone in the school, students and teachers alike, knew who she was," Aunt Xiao began. "Why?" I asked, even more intrigued. "She was exceptional, brilliant academically, stunningly beautiful, and an incredible pianist. Imagine in those days how many kids could play the piano. Just having enough to eat and wear was a luxury." Aunt Xiao was right. In that era, Aunt Zhao's background would have made her stand out dramatically. You young people today idolize celebrities. Back then, your Aunt Zhao was our idol. I was her, what do you call it these days? Superfan, I quickly offered. Yes. I was her superfan. As she spoke, a nostalgic smile lit up her face, as if she were transported back in time. I was just as passionate about my idol as any of you are today. After school, I would follow her, mimicking the way she walked and talked. I'd stand outside her gate, refusing to leave until she went inside. I always dreamed of becoming just like her one day. Then one day, she noticed me. She stood in front of me and asked why I kept following her. Do you know how I felt at that moment? I was both nervous and thrilled. My idol was speaking to me. I was so overwhelmed that I started crying. My crying startled her. She thought she had frightened me and quickly apologized, even pulling some candy out of her bag to give me. It was the best candy I've ever had in my life. After that, we became friends. We walked to and from school together every day. Later, I learned that despite being so extraordinary, she was lonely. No one dared approach her because they felt she was unapproachable. By pure luck, I stumbled into her life and became her friend. Wasn't I fortunate? Aunt Zhao's face radiated happiness as she recounted her story. I nodded and, unable to resist, asked another question. How did she meet Mr. Li? At the mention of Mr. Li, Aunt Zhao's cheerful demeanor vanished. She frowned and picked up a knife to chop cabbage with unusual force. Do you dislike Mr. Li too? I asked, unwisely pressing further. What did you just call him? Mr. Li? That's hilarious. Do you know his childhood nickname? It was Litidan. Litidan? I exclaimed, then burst into laughter, unable to hold it in. I never would have guessed. Mr. Li always dresses so stylishly, exuding sophistication. I thought he must have at least been a university graduate. University graduate? He can barely read 2 baskets of characters. Aunt Xiao said disdainfully. I couldn't stop laughing at her vivid description. The image of the refined Mr. Li clashed so absurdly with what I was hearing. If it weren't for Peilon, he'd still be living like a lump of mud, she said with obvious contempt. Really? But he seems so well off now, I prodded, hoping she'd reveal more. Well off. Do you know what he did before marrying Peilon? He was a temporary worker at a steel factory. After they got married, Peilon used her connections to help him get a permanent position. That's how he became an official worker. But given such a disparity in their circumstances, why would Aunt Zhao marry him? Most men found Peilon's qualities too intimidating and didn't dare approach her. That's how Li Yongqiang, like me, stumbled into her life and lucked into a treasure. What? Aunt Xiao, you have to tell me how that happened, I exclaimed, unable to contain my curiosity any longer. Peilon worked at a research institute and took the bus to work every day. One day, her wallet was stolen. When the conductor came to collect her fare, she couldn't pay and was flustered. Li Yongqiang happened to be on the same bus. I guess he thought she was pretty, so he gallantly paid her fare. That was how they started talking. After that, he pursued her relentlessly, and somehow, I don't know what possessed her, but she agreed to marry him. Then they tied the knot. His family was infamous for their poverty back in the day. He was the eldest of 6 siblings, and their household never had enough food to last the month. Everyone in the family was so malnourished their faces looked waxy and yellow. Any girl who knew about his background wouldn't marry him. They knew marrying into that family was like falling into a pit. Only Peilon had the courage to do it. Honestly, she was just too naive. As if venting her frustration, Aunt Xiao grabbed the knife and chopped a cabbage stem fiercely before calming down. One bus ticket was all it took for him to marry a rich, beautiful woman. I'm speechless, I said, stunned. Suddenly, the simplicity of that era seemed appealing. Crossing social classes could be achieved so easily. By that logic, he should have treated Aunt Xiao well, I remarked. Expect gratitude from a scumbag? Look at everything he's done over the years. It's disgusting. Because of him, Peilon never had children of her own. It's truly unfair. Why didn't Aunt Xiao have children? Because that Li Taidan had low sperm motility. In plain terms, he was infertile. I was at a loss for words, unsure how to process this revelation. Then why hasn't Aunt Xiao divorced him? Is she financially dependent on him? Dependent? On a man whose retirement pension is only 2,500 yuan? The one refusing to divorce isn't Peilon, it's him. This entire household is supported by Peilon. This revelation left me stunned. To be honest, it's all thanks to Peilon's parents for having the foresight. Before they passed, they drafted a gift agreement transferring the house to Peilon's name. Not only that, but they also placed all their assets into a trust. As long as Peilon is alive, she receives a monthly allowance of $30,000. After her death, whatever remains will be donated to charity. If it weren't for her parents' arrangements, that Li scoundrel would have drained Peilon dry a long time ago, leaving nothing behind. Although Peilon had strained her relationship with her parents by marrying that scoundrel, in the end, her parents still protected her. Given all that, Aunt Xiao has even more reason to divorce him. Marriage is between 2 people. It's not up to him alone to refuse. Aunt Xiao can file for divorce herself. I was furious beyond words. How could such a shameless man exist? Hearing this, Aunt Xiao sighed deeply, then looked at me in silence for a long moment. What's wrong, Aunt Xiao? Did I say something wrong? I asked, confused. She shook her head, then after a long pause, stared at the knife in her hand and said, Child, you don't yet understand how harsh the world can be. Sometimes, it's easy to get married, but divorcing is another matter. What's so hard about it? I'll convince Aunt Xiao to divorce him right now, I said, feeling like I couldn't wait another second. Hold on. If you're going to convince her to divorce, at least wait until after I leave, all right? It would be awkward for me if you did it now. Hearing her words, I realized I had been impulsive. Aunt Xiao, I'm sorry. I wasn't thinking about your feelings. I quickly apologized. It's okay. I know you're doing it for Peilon's sake, she said kindly. As Aunt Xiao and I emerged from the kitchen after finishing dinner preparations, we ran into Mr. Li. Oh, you're here today? Mr. Li said, a gleam flashing briefly in his eyes when he saw Aunt Xiao. Yes, Aunt Xiao replied curtly, not saying much as she carried the food upstairs. Not wanting to speak to him either, I made an excuse to bring the soup upstairs as well. You don't need to stay with me. Xiao Xia is here, and that's enough. Go downstairs and have your meal before it gets cold. It would be a pity to waste Xiao Xia's hard work, Aunt Xiao said firmly, refusing to let Aunt Xiao stay with her. Unable to argue, Aunt Xiao reluctantly went back downstairs to eat. That evening, Aunt Xiao ate exceptionally slowly, as though something was on her mind. "Is the food not to your liking today?" I asked cautiously. "No, it's wonderful. I just want to savor it a little more," she said with a smile. Though she reassured me, I could tell something was different about her that night. After finishing, I cleared the dishes and carried them downstairs. However, as I descended the stairs, I was stunned by the scene in the dining room. Mr. Li had one arm around Aunt Xiao's waist and was insisting on feeding her with the other hand. Aunt Xiao turned her face away, refusing, but Mr. Li continued his shameless persistence. This disgusting old pervert. How could he try to take advantage of anyone, even Aunt Xiao's friend? There was no way I could tolerate this. Without thinking, I flung the dishes in my hands toward the floor. The loud crash startled Mr. Li, making him release his grip immediately. At the same time, Aunt Xiao stood up, visibly flustered. "What are you doing?" Mr. Li shouted angrily at me. "Oops, slipped out of my hands," I said boldly. "Clumsy. Do you have any idea how much those dishes cost?" "I'm telling you, this is coming out of your paycheck," he raged. "Fine, deduct it. It's no big deal," I shot back, standing my ground for the first time. "You're out of line. Breaking dishes and acting righteous about it? Don't think just because Peilon spoils you that you can behave recklessly. Let me remind you, I'm still the head of this household." Mr. Li fumed, his anger barely concealed. Ignoring him, I walked past him toward the kitchen to get more food. "Old Li, she's just a young girl. Don't lower yourself to her level," Aunt Xiao interjected, her tone soft and conciliatory, completely unlike the disdain she had shown for him earlier in the kitchen. I was surprised but figured it made sense. As a guest, Aunt Xiao probably didn't want to be openly confrontational, no matter how she felt about him. At her urging, Mr. Li grumbled and stormed back to his room, while Aunt Xiao began cleaning up the shattered dishes. "Are you okay? Did he hurt you?" I asked, concerned as I approached her. She shook her head but avoided meeting my eyes. Sensing her discomfort, I decided not to press further and helped her clean up the mess I had made. What happened next was even more shocking. After washing the dishes, I returned to find Aunt Xiao entering Mr. Li's room. She didn't come out all night. I was completely devastated. How could this be happening? Was this the same Aunt Xiao who had spoken so disdainfully about Mr. Li just that afternoon? She was supposed to be Aunt Xiao's dear friend. I sat at the stairway all night, staring at Mr. Li's closed door, unable to sleep. Early the next morning, a disheveled Aunt Xiao emerged from the room. "Good morning, Aunt Xiao. Did you sleep well?" I asked, my tone dripping with sarcasm. She froze, clearly not expecting to see me so early. After a moment of awkward silence, she stammered, "Morning." I said nothing more, fixing her with an unwavering stare. Flustered, she grabbed her bag and left in a hurry, not even bothering to wash up. For some reason, I felt an overwhelming sense of grievance, and tears welled up in my eyes. I turned and ran upstairs, bursting into Aunt Xiao's room. Hugging her tightly, I cried, "Aunt Xiao, why won't you divorce him? Why live like this?" Aunt Xiao lay quietly in bed, her eyes closed. But I knew she was awake. After a long silence, she finally said, "You saw it all, didn't you?" I nodded. "She's not worthy of being your friend. Perhaps what you saw isn't the whole truth. I'm waiting for an outcome," Aunt Xiao said softly. I didn't understand, but she didn't elaborate, instead seeming to drift back into sleep. For an entire week, I hadn't spoken properly to Aunt Xiao. I didn't even know why I was upset. "Child, it seems like you've been holding something against me recently. Other than doing your tasks, you don't talk to me much," Aunt Xiao teased, her tone lighthearted but knowing. "No, I'm not," I muttered, keeping my head down as I washed her body. "I need you to help me with something important later," she said suddenly. "Okay, I replied mechanically, uninterested. After finishing her care routine and settling her back in bed, I turned to take the basin of water away. Suddenly, she grabbed my arm and said with a serious expression, "Child, help me get a lawyer. I want to file for divorce." "Really?" I exclaimed in disbelief, so startled that I spilled some of the water from the basin. Aunt Zhao nodded firmly. When the lawyer sat across from Aunt Zhao, I overheard even more shocking details. "If he still refuses to divorce me, then I will sue him for intentional harm," Aunt Zhao declared. It turned out her condition, her crippled legs, was all thanks to that vile man. 3 years ago, after discovering his true nature, Aunt Zhao had resolutely demanded a divorce. After exhausting every tactic to manipulate her, he pretended to agree. But the very next morning, he poured cooking oil on the stairs, causing Aunt Zhao to slip and fall, breaking both legs. Even after the accident, he didn't take her to the hospital. Instead, he insisted on home care, during which he provided no treatment whatsoever. Over time, her legs completely atrophied. Aunt Zhao had tried to escape, but all her attempts failed. He took her phone away, and the housekeepers he hired were quickly bribed into becoming his mistresses. She became like a lone boat adrift in a vast ocean. At one point, she even considered ending her own life. But the vile man wouldn't let her die. She was his cash cow, a steady source of income. So he kept her alive, just barely. It wasn't until she began pretending to be senile and bedridden that he let his guard down and hired me to care for her. "That's not all, he's sick. That's why I refuse to stay with him any longer," Aunt Zhao added. "Sick? What kind of illness?" the lawyer asked, surprised. "AIDS," Aunt Zhao said bluntly. The 3 letters made me jump out of my seat. I couldn't believe it. How had I never known? "Don't worry, Ms. Zhao. I'll handle this case and ensure you leave him as soon as possible," the lawyer said, visibly angered by everything he had just heard. After the lawyer left, I rushed to Aunt Zhao. "Aunt Zhao, is it true? He has AIDS?" I asked, still in shock. She nodded. "Are you scared?" "Not scared, just shocked. And he still has the energy to go out and seduce other women? What about you? Are you okay?" I was genuinely worried about her. "I'm fine. He doesn't know about his condition yet," she said with a faint smile. "What? Then how do you know?" I asked, even more curious now. Aunt Zhao's expression turned somber as she explained. "Your Aunt Zhao is a good person. You misunderstood her. This goes back 2 years. She came to visit me after returning from out of town. When she saw my condition, she broke down in tears. I told her everything, and she decided to take revenge for me. Your Aunt Zhao has had a hard life herself. Her ex-husband was a drug addict who drained their family's assets and contracted AIDS. After a harrowing divorce, she managed to escape back here, only to discover she had also been infected. Faced with this cruel reality, she resolved to use herself to avenge me. 2 years ago, she began visiting regularly, pretending to cozy up to him. That kind of man can't resist temptation. It didn't take more than a few sweet words to lure him in. The last time Aunt Zhao visited, she told me she had noticed him showing early symptoms. It seems the time is near. If you hadn't come into my life, I would have stopped hoping for a divorce. I was waiting for this, the day he gets what he deserves. But you, my dear girl, you changed my mind. You made me realize it's not worth wasting the rest of my life on him. I should live for myself. That's why I've decided to listen to you and pursue the divorce." Hearing this, I finally understood everything. Taking a deep breath, I walked to the window, then turned back to Aunt Zhao and asked, "Aunt Zhao, may I open this window now?" "Of course," she said with a nod. With her permission, I pushed the window open. The fragrant scent of blooming roses wafted in, filling the room with the fresh promise of a new beginning.